Sandy Locklear was a young widow and a struggling single mother.
She went through a lot. It was definitely tough to make sure that her children had what they needed.
But then she met Amos Hatfield, a widower old enough to be her father.
He wanted to help her out.
Amos was very giving to Sandy and to her children.
And before long, the lonely widow and widower found love.
She cared a lot for my grandpa.
He was smiling again. I even told her, I said, thank you for making my daddy smile.
But their happiness wouldn't last. Just after their first anniversary, the marriage would end in a brutal attack.
Is your husband breathing at all?
Two men wearing masks had broken into the home.
Those boys are raping me.
Was the attack a home invasion?
They were saying, get on the ground, where are the drugs, where's the money?
Was Amos's son actually the target?
Tommy had some drug issues in the past.
Or was Sandy secretly the key to solving the murders?
Sandy wasn't telling me everything.
That was not supposed to go down like that.
Loris, South Carolina is a sleepy town of 2,000, 10 miles inland from Myrtle Beach.
It's a complete contrast to what you see in Myrtle Beach with all of the attractions and tourists coming in. 10 miles out there, you have complete countryside with, horses and cattle roaming around and people still tilling the earth.
But on August 19th, 2012, at around 4 o'clock in the morning, a few hours before even Loris's farmers rose for the day, Horry County 911 received a chilling call.
911. Yes. I need somebody here immediately. Okay, ma'am, what's going on there? There's a shooting. I think 2 people are dead.
The caller was 40-year-old Sandy Locklear.
Sandy had told the 911 operator that 2 men forced their way in.
They had on black masks and masks. Yes. They dragged me back to the bedroom and they beat me and my husband over the head.
Is your husband breathing at all?
He's bloody all over.
And in addition to her husband, 66-year-old Amos Hatfield, Sandy believed that the intruders had attacked Amos's 40-year-old son, Tommy, who also lived in the trailer.
I don't know where he is. He's not answering me.
And while the intruders had left her alive, Sandy said she hadn't escaped unscathed.
They got me in the bedroom.
Who has you in the bedroom?
This boy, they raped me.
It was a horrifying tale. But once the police uncovered the details behind Sandy and Amos's marriage, they would soon be wondering, had she simply been lucky to survive? Or was Sandy more than just a witness? Born in 1971, Sandy Locklear started life just over the state line.
Sandy was born in Laurinburg, North Carolina. Sandy then moved to South Carolina when her parents got divorced.
Her parents split up when she was only 9 years old. Her father went to prison soon after, and Sandy spent most of her childhood moving around with her single mom.
She had a rough childhood based on everything that I know about her. She went through a lot.
And unfortunately, the obstacles continued to mount once Sandy's mother moved the family to New Jersey.
They were not wealthy, not well-to-do. Life was hard for her. She dropped out of school when she was in 8th grade.
But Sandy was determined to make something of her life. She eventually got her GED and went on to become a certified nursing assistant.
She worked during that job for several years.
She got married and had a child, too. But when the marriage eventually ended in divorce in 2001, Sandy and her 11-year-old daughter left New Jersey.
She'd returned to where she grew up.
Settling in Tabor City, North Carolina, she married a second time. And just as her first daughter became an adult, Sandy gave birth to a second daughter. But her happy family life would be marred by tragedy.
The gentleman that Sandy was married to at that point in time, he died. It was a car accident.
And that left Sandy on her own again.
It was definitely tough for Sandy. She struggled trying to make ends meet, trying to make sure that her children had what they needed.
But after 6 years as a single mom, The 39-year-old met someone who understood her struggle with loneliness all too well. Unlike Sandy, Amos Hatfield wasn't a North Carolina native. He was a veteran from West Virginia.
He was in the Air Force for almost 28 years.
And the Air Force had allowed him to see the world.
He enjoyed going places, knowing different countries. His favorite, though, it was Germany, because that's where he met my mother, the love of his life.
The couple married in 1966 and had 2 children, daughter Sylvia in 1967 and her little brother Tommy in 1971.
I was born in Germany, and Tommy, he was born in Virginia.
But after living in Germany, England, and Spain, the Air Force family landed stateside when the kids were teenagers.
We moved down here to Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, and we've stayed here.
And after more than 2 decades in the military, Amos retired and devoted his time to enjoying the rural Carolinas.
Fishing and hunting, that was really his main hobbies. And he helped my dad and stuff, do stuff outside, whatever he needed help with, he'd help him.
He also loved doting on his grandchildren.
He was the best grandpa I could have ever asked for. Everything. Anything I would have ever wanted or needed, he would have gave me.
However, Amos's blissful retirement wouldn't last long.
My mother died in July of 2001. She had cancer.
A widower at only 55, Amos was devastated.
I remember he was very sad, very depressed after my grandma passed away. They were the perfect couple.
He was very lonely. He didn't have anybody. He lived with us for about 2 months.
Afterwards, he stayed close to his daughter and her children, too, eventually settling near their home in Loris, South Carolina, a few miles inland from Myrtle Beach.
He found a little trailer and he stayed there.
It was on a pretty big lot. It was a several-acre lot. So it was pretty isolated from the other homes in the community.
But being near his grandchildren helped alleviate the widower's loneliness.
He'd come over after school and just hang out with us.
And 9 years after his wife's death, Amos would have even more company when his 39-year-old son, Tommy, moved into the trailer.
Tommy and his wife, they started having problems, and they kind of went their separate ways.
Amos was happy to help his son through the rough patch.
Tommy was trying to move on with his life and just trying to better himself.
And while his son regrouped, Amos discovered a new diversion from his loneliness, driving across the state line to play video poker in North Carolina.
That was his hobby. He liked to gamble. He was a night owl. He liked to do stuff at nighttime.
And it was while playing video poker at a Tabor City convenience store that the lonely widower found someone with similar interests.
One night, he came home and he said he met somebody. And I said, well, what's her name? And he said, Sandy.
According to his daughter, Amos had originally taken pity on the struggling single mom.
He said she has a little girl that's 5 years old, and her little girl supposedly got sick a lot, and my father wanted to help her out.
Although there may have been more to it than that.
She was not an unattractive woman. She was a very exotic-looking woman. He obviously must have found her attractive.
The pair soon started dating, despite the 26-year difference in their ages.
I think he was wanting companionship, and I think for her, she wanted security.
But what would his family say? When he took Sandy to his grandson's wedding in December of 2010, they were impressed.
That was the first time I met her, and she seemed very nice. She seemed very outgoing. She seemed like she cared a lot for my grandpa.
And she obviously made Amos happy.
He wasn't as lonely, and he was smiling again. And I remember I even told her, I said, thank you for making my daddy smile.
In return, Amos was true to his word, doing everything he could to help Sandy and her children.
Amos was very giving to Sandy and to her children, to both her kids, and took special care of her younger child. and helped out with school clothes and with getting everything that she needed.
He bought Sandy a car, and then in June of 2011, he even topped that.
He bought her a house in Tabor City, a brick home, so that she could raise her little girl, and she had another daughter that was going off to college.
This house was, something wonderful and something that she had aspired to all her life. And finally, she had a man in Amos who was willing to provide that for her.
A month later, in July 2011, Amos and Sandy married.
I think he fell in love with the idea of being in love and being able to take care of somebody.
But their happiness would be brief. Barely a year after Sandy and Amos said, "I do," the authorities would be wondering, could Amos continue taking care of Sandy even after he was gone? Coming up, the investigators struggle to understand the savage assault on Sandy, Amos, and Tommy.
Why this house? Why these victims?
And most of all, why would the attackers leave one victim alive?
Sandy was the only witness.
In the pre-dawn hours of August 19, 2012, 40-year-old Sandy Locklear called 911 in Horry County, South Carolina, and reported that she and her husband had just been attacked by two men.
They came through the back door on us with guns.
Her husband and her stepson were both shot.
And according to Sandy, the intruders had harmed her, too.
They had me tied to the bed.
They had you tied to the bed?
Yeah, they raped me.
Sandy said she'd managed to free herself after the attackers left.
All right, baby. Well, how long ago did this happen?
About 40 minutes ago.
I have help on the way, baby, okay? Stay with me.
Oh, thank you.
And moments later, while Sandy was still on the line with
At the police?
inside the house, the deputies found the bodies of 66-year-old Amos Hatfield and his 40-year-old son, Tommy.
There were pillows over their heads, and they were obviously deceased.
Sandy, they found huddled in the back bedroom, where the attackers had left her bound.
She'd been taped up. She still actually had some tape, some duct tape, that was stuck to her clothes or her wrist. She had freed herself from this duct tape in order to get the phone and call 911.
And the entire ordeal had clearly left her badly shaken.
Sandy was obviously distraught. I told her that we were here to help her, she was safe with us, and that we were going to take her to the hospital.
And not just for treatment.
If she was a victim of sexual assault, her body's a crime scene.
They had to do what's known as a rape kit.
There's going to be evidence on her that can degrade by the hour. So it's very important to get her to the hospital to start the medical process, medical exam, to recover any evidence that might be on her.
With Sandy on her way to the hospital, the investigators turned their attention to the crime scene.
It looked like an execution-style murder.
They had both been shot through the head, and the culprit had used a pillow to silence the gunshot.
However, the bodies laid out on the living room floor weren't all that the investigators noticed.
There was a coffee table that had been overturned. There was ashtray that had been thrown all over the place.
The house appeared to have been ransacked a little bit, consistent with what would have been maybe a push-in robbery or a home invasion robbery.
But if it was a home invasion, there were still plenty of questions left unanswered.
It was a bit perplexing. Why this house? Why these victims?
Was it just a random crime?
When I went to talk to the neighbors, they'd known that there'd been a lot of break-ins in the area, a lot of home burglaries.
Or was it possible that Amos or his son had been specifically targeted? One of the first officers at the scene provided a possible answer.
I had been told by one of the other investigators or one of the patrol officers who knew him, Tommy Hatfield, had a life in the drug community.
According to what friends and family told the investigators, Tommy's history with drugs was intertwined with the collapse of his marriage.
Tommy got married when he was 24 years old in 1995, and they had 3 children, and one passed away from crib death.
The sudden loss of their baby boy in 2001 left Tommy and his wife devastated.
when they lost their baby. He turned to drugs. It was marijuana, and he would take pills.
The drugs had eventually led to the end of their marriage and pushed Tommy even deeper into addiction.
He was separated from his wife, and he was really devastated. He was self-medicating with pills, and he drank a lot, just trying to numb the pain.
And not just the pain of his son's death and his failed marriage.
Our mother passed away, and that was another setback. My mom and my father, they stood by Tommy through thick and thin. They did everything they could for Tommy.
But in 2007, Tommy's oldest daughter died too.
She passed away 2 days after her 18th birthday in a car accident.
His daughter's death threw Tommy into another tailspin.
It just seemed to get harder and harder.
He wasn't a terrible person, but he had had a few run-ins with the law.
But recently, Tommy had taken steps to turn his life around.
Around 2011, Tommy moved in with my daddy.
Amos was there for him, living there with him so that he could help him.
My grandpa always looked out for my uncle.
And with his father's support, Tommy had tried to make a fresh start.
He, to me, seemed like he was getting better and he was in our life again more.
He stopped the drugs. He never got in trouble with law enforcement, and I believe that changed his whole outcome.
Tommy had stopped having trouble with the law, but looking at the way he and his father had been murdered, the investigators couldn't help but wonder, had he angered someone from his drug days?
A crime scene like that would not have been inconsistent with a drug-related crime. This was apparently a fairly well-staged, well-planned out crime to overpower two fairly large fellas and then execute them the way they did.
But had the killers made a crucial mistake by leaving Sandy alive?
Sandy was the only witness, and it was very important to sit down with Sandy and learn everything she knew about this particular incident.
She was going to help us solve this crime.
At least, that's what the investigators hoped when they brought her into the police station after the rape counselors released her from the hospital.
She had some scrubs on because they kept her clothes, as is customary in a rape case.
And she clearly remained shaken by the whole ordeal.
She was upset. She was crying in shock from seeing what she apparently saw.
During the interview, Sandy said that she and Amos had planned to spend the evening watching TV.
She was going to watch golf with him. Amos and she had talked on the phone earlier in that day and made plans.
And after watching TV, according to Sandy, they'd stayed up talking.
They talked, and they may have smoked some cigarettes, and at some point they got up to get ice cream. And when they were going to get ice cream in the kitchen, the door, boom, got kicked open.
Two men wearing masks had broken into the home, screaming, hollering.
They were saying, get on the ground, where are the drugs, where's the money?
And based on what Sandy said, the investigators had been right to wonder if the attack had something to do with Tommy's troubled past.
Sandy said these two men screamed almost immediately, "We got you, Tommy boy, we got you, Tommy boy."
She says that Tommy seemed to recognize them. And no doubt in her mind, they were intent on attacking Tommy.
Exactly what transpired in the living room, Sandy couldn't say.
While one of them guarded Tommy and Amos, the other one forced her into a back bedroom and sexually assaulted her. And then she was in a back bedroom when she heard shots.
But based on what she told the investigators, one thing seemed clear.
Everything led me to believe that the push-in robbery was drug-related.
Coming up, the investigators uncover a new wrinkle.
There was a lot of tension there between Tommy and Sandy Locklear.
And that leads to more questions.
It started to become apparent to me that Sandy wasn't telling me everything.
By mid-morning of August 19th, 2012, it had been only a few hours since 40-year-old Sandy Locklear called 911 to report that intruders had murdered her husband and stepson in their Loris, South Carolina home.
They were both shot in the back of the head. Just smells of execution from one end to the other.
The victims were 66-year-old Amos Hatfield and 40-year-old Tommy Hatfield.
Tommy had some drug issues in the past that he was trying to recover from, and Amos was trying to help him get back on the right track.
And based on what Sandy had just told the investigators, that may have cost Amos his life.
She told me that two individuals pushed through the door, started immediately yelling, "Tommy boy, we got you now. We want the drugs, we want our money," which led me to believe that this was a drug-related crime.
The attackers had left Sandy alive, but she hadn't escaped entirely.
She stated that one of them drugged Sandy to the back bedroom, threw her on the bed, ripped off her clothes, and raped her.
Sandy said the attackers had been wearing masks, but did she know anything that could possibly give the investigators a lead?
They started asking her, where could these boys have come from?
If she was in Tommy's life, there would not be a stretch that she might have seen these people that Tommy hung out with.
Sandy said she did remember something. Was it the breakthrough they needed?
Sandy started to say yes, that one of them did kind of look familiar.
In fact, according to Sandy, she'd seen him just an hour or two before the murder.
She begins telling a story about how she stopped at a convenience store in Loris, and she says two strangers came up and asked her out of the blue, "Do you know Amos Hatfield? Or do you know Tommy Hatfield?"
Sandy said she thought nothing of it at the time, but she had answered that she not only knew Tommy, she was married to his father, Amos.
She said, "Yes, he's my husband, and I'm going over to his house." And she said, "They must have followed me."
It was an amazing coincidence, to say the least.
They just happened to hit the lotto, these guys. They just happened to run into the one person that was related to them. We found that a little bit odd.
It started to become apparent to me that Sandy wasn't telling me everything, that she had information that she needed to share, that at that particular time she was not willing to share. And then the interview started to take on more of a interrogation tone.
Was it possible Tommy and her husband hadn't been murdered over a drug debt?
Drug dealers would much rather have their money paid than have two bodies on their hands. So the story it wasn't adding up.
Over the next several hours, the investigators continued to interrogate Sandy.
Sandy had come up with an answer for every question I had given her.
But Sandy wasn't the only person the investigators were talking to. They also asked Amos and Tommy's family to come in for interviews.
Simultaneously to my interview with Sandy, there's other detectives that are doing a parallel investigation.
And what they heard from Amos's family about Sandy's marriage was more than a little eye-opening.
They had a unorthodox living arrangement.
Because despite being married, Sandy and Amos didn't live together.
She had never stayed at Amos's really overnight before. They'd been married for a little over a year. She never stayed there.
Instead, Sandy and her 5-year-old daughter lived across the state line in the house Amos bought her.
It was kind of a bizarre marital setup.
In fact, Amos's daughter told the investigators that he'd initially kept the marriage secret.
I did not know about it until 6 months later.
Of course, they had reason to keep it quiet.
Sandy was a much younger woman, and Amos was an older fella, and I guess he thought that the family might object.
The family had objected.
She was younger than me. I had a big problem with that.
Although Amos's daughter could at least understand why her father had done it.
I would not put it past my daddy to go off and get married so that he could have the little girl on his health insurance so that she could be taken care of.
Amos's son, Tommy, was far less understanding, though.
Tom did not like them getting married.
And he really didn't like the way Sandy treated Amos.
She would not allow Mr. Hatfield to be in her home or spend the night in her home. He bought that home for her. Why was he not allowed to go stay with her?
According to friends and family, Tommy was convinced that Sandy was taking advantage of his father.
There was a lot of tension there between Tommy and Sandy Locklear.
My uncle always told us that she didn't come around unless she wanted something. Most of the time it was money for beer, or cigarettes, or gas money.
That wasn't all he had suspected either.
Tom thought there was other men in her life.
And then there was Amos's mysterious illness. According to the family, Amos had suddenly become sick a few months before the murder.
He would be incoherent. He didn't know what day it was.
It worried me bad that seeing my grandpa laying in the bed and barely having his eyes open, not knowing who my mom was, that was definitely scary, and that was not like him.
The family said they had suspected Sandy.
We thought that she was poisoning him.
And they'd tried to tell Amos, too.
We sat down with him a few times and was talking to him about it and saying, she's not good for you. She's poisoning you or drugging you or doing something.
Although according to the family, Amos would hear none of it.
He just got defensive every time and said, you guys don't know her. She's a very nice lady. She's not like that. And he would just stick up for her.
Had Amos's trust in Sandy been a fatal mistake? The investigators were starting to wonder.
All these factors together just really caused a lot more suspicion to fall on Sandy Locklear.
And the investigators had even more reason to be suspicious when they contacted the hospital and spoke to the doctors and counselors who'd treated Sandy.
The rape kit came back negative. There was no rape that the rape kit could find. There was no penetration.
But did that mean Sandy was lying?
For a sexual assault to occur, there doesn't have to be penetration.
Still, the rape kit results didn't match Sandy's statement. And that wasn't the only piece of evidence that made them doubt Sandy.
Search warrants were being served on her phone records.
And when the investigators got their hands on those records later that same afternoon, they made a telling discovery.
Shortly before 3 a.m., the morning of August 19th, there's a text to Sandy Locklear's phone asking if the door was locked. There was another text message 3 to 5 minutes later, a response saying, it's unlocked now. At that moment, we knew she was involved. That was the big aha moment.
This was 4 or 5 hours into the interview, I think. This pivotal point in the investigation, there was a knock on the door, and the captain from the unit handed me phone records. I said to Sandy, do you recognize this phone number? She said, yes. I said, who is it? She said, it's my cousin. I said, your cousin? I said, you texting your cousin 4 o'clock in the morning? What were you texting about? Oh, we were just saying hi and general chit-chat.
The investigators knew they had caught her in a lie.
I said, you opened up the back door to let these people in.
And it was when faced with just how much the investigators already knew that Sandy's story took a sudden and dramatic turn.
She looked at me and said, nobody was supposed to get hurt.
Coming up, Sandy tells her side of the story. And the investigators uncover a motive.
It was about money and greed.
By the afternoon of August 19th, it had been more than 4 hours since the Horry County, South Carolina investigators had begun interviewing 40-year-old Sandy Locklear.
They began the interview and treated her as a victim, as a witness, and said, please just tell us what happened.
The investigators were trying to get to the bottom of a traumatic incident that had started 12 hours earlier, when 2 men had burst into the Loris, South Carolina home of Sandy's husband, 66-year-old Amos Hatfield.
She claimed that they duct taped her and raped her in the bedroom.
And according to Sandy, while she had been tied up in the bedroom, the 2 men had murdered Amos and his son, 40-year-old Tommy Hatfield.
She heard shots coming from the living room where Amos and Tommy were executed.
But then, the investigators uncovered text messages between Sandy and the mysterious intruders, informing them that the back door was unlocked.
There's evidence that shows you texted to do attention. And there's only one reason for you to do that. Because somebody opened the door and committed a murder.
When police presented the text messages to Sandy, her demeanor completely changed.
No more lies, okay? Okay? No more lies.
She crumbles. She says, yes, I did it. It was part of a plan, but it wasn't to kill anybody.
She was telling police no one was supposed to get hurt.
Not that the police believed her.
I said, okay, Sandy, obviously you've been lying to me. You are under arrest.
And then, to emphasize the point, the investigators put her in handcuffs. But that didn't mean they were through with her.
I sat her back down and I said, now you have to tell me what's going on.
Sandy began by saying that the break-in that led to the murder had been Amos's idea, part of a plan to get his son off drugs once and for all.
Mr. Bush, come in there and get it out and leave. That was it. That was it. I swear to God.
What Sandy was suggesting was that they had discussed, her and Amos had discussed, trying to scare him straight.
And according to Sandy, it was Amos who'd hired the two men, although she only knew one of their names.
She believed this individual's name was James.
Well, the James I'm talking about is the one who cut my grass.
But Sandy claimed she didn't know the other man, the man she said had actually pulled the trigger.
This guy completely out of hand. That was not supposed to go down like that.
Was it possibly true? Could Amos have been behind the attack? The investigators had their doubts.
Amos had been through the ringer with Tommy before. He'd seen him in the depths of addiction, but there wasn't any evidence of addiction at this point.
Still, the investigators followed up on Sandy's claims. And when they tracked down the man who cut Sandy's lawn, 28-year-old James Evans, they made a surprising discovery.
James had a little bit of a criminal record.
Could Sandy have been telling the truth when she identified James as one of the killers?
A member of our patrol division knew of family members of James Evans and convinced him to turn himself in.
And when the investigators sat him down for questioning, he quickly caved.
I said that, James, you just don't, seem like a hard guy. How'd you get involved in this? And he said it was about the money. He says, Sandy came to me and said, do you want to make some money? I said, what kind of money are you talking about? And she said, big money. I said, well, what's big money? I said, big money would have been $50,000.
And that 50 grand was only his cut.
She told James that she was going to receive an inheritance or an insurance policy of $1 million.
But while James admitted being part of it, he denied being the killer.
James said, I didn't see who did the shooting.
However, he did give the investigators the name of the other intruder, 22-year-old Odom Bryant.
Odom Bryant. He was the nephew of James's girlfriend.
He's a career criminal.
And considering the details of his record, the investigators figured they'd found their killer.
Odom Bryant was under suspicion for another shooting over in Tabor City.
Although by the time the Horry County investigators started looking for him, he was long gone.
There was no tracing him.
The U.S. Marshal Service came in to help out.
It took 4 weeks, but the marshals were finally able to track him down.
He was arrested in Winston-Salem.
And when he was brought back to South Carolina on September 19th, the hardened criminal tried to play things cool.
I just enjoy your presence. Okay, then we're done.
I smiled at him, I shook his hand, and I stood up. And that's when he said, James talked, didn't he?
And once he realized that the investigators had him, he tried to save himself.
We didn't know it was her husband. Only thing she told us was she wanted us to go in there and scare the dude up. That's what she told us, to be exact. She told us she wanted us to go in there and scare the dude up.
And just like Sandy, he claimed that things hadn't gone according to plan. Although according to Bryant, he wasn't the one who'd gotten out of control.
The trigger man, Sandy, she killed both of them people.
Did you see Sandy with the gun in her hand?
That's right. And I can actually say I knew for a fact Sandy Locklear was the trigger man.
And with that, the case basically boiled down to he said, she said.
Odom Bryant said Sandy Locklear did the shooting. Sandy Locklear said Odom Bryant did the shooting.
But would that be enough for Sandy to dodge a murder conviction? On June 2nd, 2014, Sandy Locklear was the first of the three co-conspirators to go on trial.
Sandy was nervous. She was shaking at the beginning of trial. Her hands were shaking.
And she had a lot to be nervous about.
Her own words, her own statements about how she was involved. We knew that was going to be one of the heaviest hitting pieces of evidence.
However, that wasn't all the prosecutors had. Once Sandy was in custody and they had James's story about a possible insurance motive, the investigators had executed a search warrant on the house Amos bought for Sandy in Tabor City.
They found like a little briefcase. It had some documentation in it. There was a life insurance policy.
This life insurance policy, on its face, reads $1 million.
And according to the prosecution's opening statement, that $1 million policy was the motive behind the murders.
It's all about money. All of it was about money and greed.
In fact, the prosecutors claimed that was the basis of Sandy and Amos's entire relationship.
He spent a lot of, if not all of his money trying to keep Sandy happy.
She was bleeding him dry with all her little bills, cigarettes, beer, making that house payment, giving her money for this or that.
Tommy's ex-girlfriend testified that Sandy had spent so much of Amos's money that it began to cause trouble between them.
They started arguing a lot on the phone, arguing about money. He would say he didn't have it.
So according to the prosecutors, Sandy had decided to cash in.
She's sitting there with $1 million policy, her golden ticket.
And to back up their claim, the prosecutors put a cousin of Sandy's on the stand.
That cousin was well aware of the life insurance policy. And Sandy Locklear, she had sort of bragged that all it would take for her to be a millionaire was for Amos Hatfield to die.
Sandy's exact quote was, "When Amos dies, I'm going to be a rich bitch."
At least, that's what Sandy thought.
With any life insurance policy, the devil's in the details.
At a cursory glance, if you just read the first couple pages, it did appear to be $1 million policy. It was only worth $1 million if Amos were to die in a commercial airline crash. I think $300,000 if he died in an automobile wreck, and $200,000 death by any other means.
Though in the rural Carolinas, even $200,000 went a long way.
Hell of a motive for a murder.
But would the jury agree? When it was the defense's turn, they stood by what Sandy and Odom Bryant had both told the police, that the attack was supposed to scare Amos's son, Tommy, who they claimed was still abusing drugs.
It makes me sick to know that she blamed this on my uncle because he tried so hard to straighten his life up.
And the insurance, according to the defense, Sandy had nothing to do with it.
Amos was the one who went out and got the policy, not Sandy Locklear.
And in closing, the defense contended that Bryant was the killer, not Sandy.
No gunshot residue was found on Sandy Locklear. None of the police officers or detectives wanted to look at whether or not Sandy even had a gun.
Perhaps because, as the prosecutors argued in their close, it ultimately didn't matter who had the gun.
It doesn't matter who pulled the trigger. In South Carolina, it's an old adage that says the hand of one is the hand of all.
Coming up, the case goes to the jury. But what will the verdict be?
You just never know what a jury's going to do.
On June 12, 2014, the jury in Sandy Locklear's murder trial announced that it had reached a verdict.
The jury came back in about 3.5 to 4 hours.
The 42-year-old mother of two was accused of masterminding the murder of her husband, Amos Hatfield, and his son, Tommy, in order to collect almost $250,000 worth of life insurance.
It was greed, money, opportunism. He was just a means to an end for her.
This was one of the most wicked crimes that I've seen.
Two other men had been charged in connection with the killing, 24-year-old Odom Bryant and 30-year-old James Evans.
Sandy Locklear, whether she pulled the trigger or not, she unleashed those two to come inside and commit a murder.
A hand of one, hand of all. If you're all actually actively engaged, when that trigger's pulled, it's as if every hand is on that gun and every finger's on that trigger.
But did the relatively short deliberation mean that the jury agreed? Sandy's attorney wasn't so sure.
I've been in cases where the jury's deliberated for 15 minutes and come back with not guilty verdicts. I've been in cases where they've been out for a while and come back with guilty. You just never know what a jury's going to do.
So until the verdict was read, no one knew just what to expect.
The jury came back with a verdict of guilty.
Sandy was shocked by the outcome.
When they found her guilty, she was upset. Once again, she knew the gig was up.
She was bawling her eyes out when they said guilty.
But that wasn't the worst news.
She received 2 consecutive life sentences.
And there was no possibility of parole.
It's not any of this stuff. Well, life means 20 years or life means 30 years. We fully expect her to die in prison.
And while they may never know whether or not she actually pulled the trigger, Amos and Tommy's family agree that in the end, it doesn't really matter.
Even if she didn't pull the trigger, she may as well have. She may as well have. Because it was all her.
To me, it'll always be her. She's the reason that they're gone.
And as for why Sandy did it, Amos's daughter can only offer up one explanation.
I just think she's very evil. She knew that my father was very lonely. And she knew he had a good heart. For her to have done something like that to a poor, sweet little man that gave her everything, I just think it's very, very evil. I'm just so glad and thankful that God and everybody, she is where she belongs.
For nearly 2 decades, a series of bombs appeared without warning across the United States. They arrived in packages, appeared in university buildings and parking lots, and once even made their way onto a commercial airplane. The people who encountered them were not connected by a personal feud with the person responsible. Some were professors, some were students, some worked in science, technology, or business. They were carrying out ordinary professional or academic routines when an object placed in their path suddenly became a weapon. Between 1978 and 1995, 16 bombing attacks would be attributed to one man. 3 people would die, 24 others would be injured. And for years, the person responsible remained unidentified. He would eventually become known as the Unabomber, a name derived from the FBI's designation for the case, Unabomb, referring to university and airline bombing. But behind that name was Theodore John Kaczynski, a man whose life had taken a striking turn long before investigators knew who he was. Kaczynski was born in Chicago in 1942. He demonstrated exceptional ability in mathematics and entered Harvard University when he was only 16 years old. He later earned a doctorate in mathematics and eventually taught at the University of California, Berkeley. On the surface, his academic background placed him within institutions that represented advanced education, scientific thought, and modern intellectual life. Yet by the beginning of the 1970s, Kaczynski was increasingly withdrawing from society. In 1971, he purchased land near Lincoln, Montana, and eventually lived there in a small cabin, largely separated from modern society. This physical withdrawal would later become one of the defining elements of the Unabomber. Investigation. The cabin was not merely the place where Kaczynski lived. Investigators would eventually establish that it was also where he constructed bombs, kept extensive written records, and planned future attacks. His isolation, therefore, had 2 very different meanings. To the outside world, he had become increasingly difficult to see. For investigators, that absence would become part of the problem they had to solve. Kaczynski's ideas centered strongly on opposition to industrial society and modern technology. Those beliefs provided the ideological background for the campaign that followed. but they cannot explain away the human consequences of what he did. His criticism of modern society became connected to deliberate acts of violence against people who had not chosen to participate in any conflict with him. The important distinction is between an idea and what a person chooses to do in its name. In Kaczynski's case, the distance between the two became the story of a criminal investigation that would last almost 20 years. The first known bombing occurred on May 25, 1978, at the University of Illinois, Chicago's Circle campus. A passerby discovered a package in a parking lot. The package appeared to have been addressed back to Professor Buckley Chris Jr. of Northwestern University. Chris did not recognize the package and contacted campus security. A security employee opened it. The device inside exploded, injuring him. At that moment, there was no public figure called the Unabomber, no recognizable pattern spanning nearly 2 decades, and no known identity attached to the person who had constructed the device. There was simply an unexplained explosion and an injured person. Yet this event would later be identified as the first bombing carried out by Kaczynski. The device itself was relatively crude compared with the bombs that would follow. But what mattered most was that it represented the beginning of a pattern. In 1979, another attack occurred at Northwestern University. A graduate student opened a box that looked like a gift. Inside was a bomb, and the resulting explosion injured the student. Later that same year, the campaign moved beyond university grounds and into the air. On November 15, 1979, a bomb was placed aboard American Airlines Flight 444. Traveling from Chicago to Washington, D.C., the device did not function as intended, but it produced smoke inside the aircraft. The plane had to make an emergency landing, and passengers were affected by the smoke. The incident was significant not only because of the danger it created, but because it helped shape the way investigators understood the emerging case. The FBI's designation, Unabomb, came from the words university and airline bombing. The name was administrative, almost clinical, but behind it was a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. In 1980, the attacks continued. A bomb concealed in a book was sent to Percy Woods, the chairman of United Airlines. Woods opened the package and was injured. The targets were beginning to suggest a broader pattern. They were not random locations selected without apparent connection. Universities, airlines, scientists, technology-related institutions, and people connected to those environments appeared repeatedly. Yet the person responsible remained hidden. The attacks also demonstrated an important characteristic of the investigation. The perpetrator was not simply attacking people who had crossed him personally. The supplied evidence indicates that many targets were selected through research in libraries rather than because Kaczynski had a personal relationship with them. That made the case particularly difficult. If investigators could not begin with a personal dispute, a known enemy, or an obvious motive tied to a particular victim, they had to work backward from the devices, the locations, the victims, and the pattern itself. In 1981, a bomb was discovered at the University of Utah before it could cause casualties. In 1982, a bomb sent to Vanderbilt University exploded when it was opened by a secretary of the dean of the computer science department, injuring her. 2 months later, another bomb exploded at Corey Hall at the University of California, Berkeley, injuring an engineering professor. In 1985, another Berkeley-related attack injured an engineering student. With each incident, the pattern became more established. The attacks involved universities, professors, students, scientists, computer-related environments, and businesses. Yet establishing a pattern was not the same as identifying the person creating it. Kaczynski's deliberate effort to avoid traceable forensic evidence made that distinction critical. Investigators had fragments of bombs, materials, correspondence, victims, crime scenes, and increasingly recognizable patterns, but they did not yet have a name. The investigation would eventually grow into a major operation involving the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. But before that investigation could reach its decisive stage, the campaign would become more deadly. On December 11th, 1985, a bomb was placed in the parking lot of a computer store in Sacramento, California. The victim was Hugh Scruton, the owner of the store. He was killed in the explosion. Scruton's death marked the first confirmed fatality in the Unabomber campaign. Until then, the attacks had produced injuries, danger, and narrowly avoided disasters. Now there was a death that could not be undone. The case had crossed another boundary. It was no longer only a series of attempted bombings and injuries. Someone had been killed. Kaczynski would remain out of public view for a period after that, but the campaign was not over. In February 1987, another bombing would produce something investigators had never had before: a witness who saw the person placing the device. And for the first time, the faceless figure behind the unexploded packages and scattered fragments would begin to acquire a human outline. The image created from that observation would become famous, but it would still not be enough to give investigators the name they needed. The man who would eventually be identified as Theodore John Kaczynski remained, for the moment, hidden in plain sight. The investigation had a growing collection of evidence, a growing number of victims, and an increasingly recognizable pattern. What it did not yet have was the final connection between the crimes and the isolated mathematician living in Montana. That connection would take years to emerge, and when it finally did, it would come not from a dramatic confrontation or a chance encounter, but from something Kaczynski himself had chosen to put into words. The death of Hugh Scruton in December 1985 had changed the character of the case. The Unabomber was no longer responsible only for injuries and narrowly avoided disasters. A person had been killed, and the investigation had to confront the possibility that the campaign could become even more dangerous. Yet the identity of the man behind the attacks remained unknown. The evidence available to investigators was scattered across different states and different kinds of locations. There were university buildings, businesses, parking lots, packages, bomb fragments, injured victims, and letters. There was a pattern, but there was still no name. Then, on February 20th, 1987, the investigation received something it had rarely possessed before: a direct observation of the person responsible. The target was a computer store in Salt Lake City, Utah. Kaczynski had placed a bomb outside the store, and the device seriously injured Michael L. Fagan, the son of the store's owner. The attack itself followed a pattern investigators had already begun to recognize. A device appeared in a setting connected to computers or technology, and an ordinary person encountered it without knowing that the object had been transformed into a weapon. But this particular incident was different because a witness saw the person who had placed the bomb. The description was limited, but it was important. The witness observed a man wearing a hood and pilot-style glasses leaving the area after placing a bag containing the bomb. For investigators who had spent years examining devices and trying to reconstruct the identity of someone who carefully avoided detection, this observation offered something concrete. There was now a description of a person rather than only a description of a crime. A sketch was created from the witness's account. It would eventually become one of the most recognizable images associated with the Unabomber. Investigation. The drawing gave the public a face to associate with the unknown bomber. But it did not provide the one thing investigators needed most: a confirmed identity. A person could be described, and a sketch could be circulated, but neither established who the suspect actually was. The case therefore continued. After the 1987 bombing, Kaczynski disappeared from public view for several years. According to the supplied information, there were no further attacks during this period until the campaign resumed in the early 1990s. For investigators, this interruption did not mean the case had been solved or that the danger had disappeared. It simply meant that the person responsible was no longer producing the same kind of visible evidence. The investigation continued to depend on the material already collected: bomb fragments, construction materials, correspondence, victims, locations, target histories, and the patterns connecting them. The FBI had established a specialized Unabomb task force in 1979, working with the ATF and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Over time, the operation grew to more than 150 investigators, analysts, and support personnel. Their task was enormous. They were not investigating a single crime scene, but a sequence stretching across nearly 2 decades. They had to determine whether seemingly separate attacks were connected, understand how targets were chosen, examine the construction of the devices, and search for any detail that might identify the person responsible. Kaczynski had made that work harder by attempting to avoid leaving forensic evidence that could be traced back to him. The investigators therefore faced an unusual problem. They had evidence that the same person was responsible for a long series of attacks, but very little that directly identified that person's real-world identity. Even the suspect's gender was not initially known with complete certainty, although investigators largely believed the perpetrator was a man. This uncertainty illustrates how unusual the case was. In many criminal investigations, investigators can begin with a victim, a relationship, a known conflict, or a witness who can identify the suspect. Here, the relationship between victim and offender was often indirect. The supplied information indicates that many targets were selected through research in libraries, rather than because Kaczynski personally knew them. That meant investigators could not simply reconstruct a personal history between the attacker and the people he targeted. They had to understand a selection process that appeared to be based on his broader opposition to industrial society, technology, science, and related institutions. The attacks resumed in 1993, and the return of the Unabomber brought with it a renewed escalation. On June 22, 1993, a geneticist at the University of California was injured when a package exploded in a kitchen. Only 2 days later, another attack occurred. A prominent computer scientist at Yale University received a mail bomb and lost several fingers when it exploded. The incidents reinforced the pattern that had emerged over the previous 15 years. Universities, scientific work, computers, and people associated with those environments remained within the scope of the attacks. But the years had also changed the significance of the investigation. The FBI was no longer dealing with an unknown bomber who had carried out several isolated incidents. It was investigating a campaign that had continued across generations of students, academics, scientists, and workers. The attacks were separated by time and geography, but the pattern remained. Then, in 1994, the campaign claimed another life. Thomas J. Mosser, an advertising executive in New Jersey, was killed in a bombing. The death brought the total number of confirmed fatalities to 2. The investigation now had another victim whose death could be connected to the same campaign. But the person responsible remained unidentified. On April 24, 1995, the campaign produced its third and final confirmed fatality. A bomb sent to an office in Sacramento killed Gilbert Brent Murray, the chairman of the California Forestry Association. His death brought the confirmed toll to 3 people killed. Across the 16 bombing attacks attributed to Kaczynski between 1978 and 1995, 24 people were injured. Those numbers are important, but numbers alone can make a long investigation seem strangely abstract. Each figure represented a person who had encountered something that appeared ordinary or harmless, before discovering that it was not. A package could become a source of injury. A workplace could become a crime scene. A university environment could become a target. A routine moment could become the instant that changed someone's life. The campaign therefore created fear not simply because of the number of attacks, but because of the uncertainty surrounding them. The perpetrator could remain invisible while the objects he left behind appeared in places where people expected ordinary mail, ordinary work, or ordinary academic activity. By 1995, however, the investigation was approaching its most important turning point. The man behind the bombings had spent years trying to communicate without revealing his identity. He had sent letters, constructed devices, and maintained his distance from the people trying to find him. But after the attacks of 1994 and 1995, he made a decision that would fundamentally change the investigation. He contacted media organizations and demanded that they publish a long essay explaining his views about modern society. The manuscript was approximately 35,000 words long and carried the title Industrial Society and its Future. The request created a difficult choice for investigators. Publishing the work meant giving space to the words of the person responsible for a deadly bombing campaign. Yet the document also offered something the investigation had never possessed on such a scale: an extensive sample of the perpetrator's own language. The FBI and the Department of Justice eventually agreed to publication in 1995, and the essay appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times. The decision was controversial, but investigators hoped that publication might help identify its author. What they could not yet know was that the document would become far more than a statement of ideology. It would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. For years, the Unabomber had attempted to remain a shadow behind his devices. Now, for the first time, he was giving the world thousands of words written in his own voice. Somewhere among the people who read those words would be someone who recognized them. And that recognition would begin the final chain of events leading investigators from the manifesto to a name: Theodore John Kaczynski. By 1995, the Unabomber investigation had reached a point that seemed almost impossible to escape. For 17 years, investigators had been following a trail of explosions, injuries, deaths, packages, fragments, letters, and carefully selected targets. Yet the person responsible remained unidentified. The FBI had built a specialized task force, eventually involving more than 150 investigators, analysts, and support personnel, but the central question remained the same: who was the man behind the bombings? The answer would begin to emerge not from another crime scene, but from a document. After the bombings of 1994 and 1995, the Unabomber contacted media organizations and demanded that they publish a long essay explaining his views about modern society. The manuscript was approximately 35,000 words long and was titled Industrial Society and Its Future. The demand presented investigators with a difficult choice. They were dealing with a person responsible for a campaign that had killed 3 people and injured 24 others. Publishing his words meant giving public attention to someone who had used violence to force that attention. Yet the document also presented an opportunity unlike anything investigators had possessed before. For years, they had studied physical evidence and fragments of correspondence. Now they had thousands of words produced by the person they were trying to identify. The FBI and the Department of Justice agreed to publication in 1995. The essay appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Once it was published, the investigation entered a new phase. The document was not simply a statement of ideas. It was also a potential linguistic fingerprint. The investigators had spent years trying to understand the unknown bomber through his actions. Now they could examine the way he expressed himself in detail. The response to the publication was enormous. Many people contacted the FBI after reading the essay, but most of those leads were not useful. A huge number of responses did not necessarily make the investigation easier. Investigators still had to distinguish meaningful information from everything else. Somewhere within that flood of reactions, however, was one person who recognized something that others did not. His name was David Kaczynski, the younger brother of Ted Kaczynski. David and his wife noticed similarities between the ideas and language contained in the published manifesto and writings they had previously encountered from Ted. The connection was deeply significant because David was not simply reacting to a photograph or a vague ressemblance. He recognized similarities in the writing itself. He and his wife saw something familiar in the way the author expressed his ideas and in the language used to present them. David provided the FBI with writings produced by his brother. Those writings gave investigators something they could compare directly with the manifesto. The comparison became one of the decisive moments in the case. FBI linguistics specialists examined similarities in vocabulary, wording, and sentence structure. According to the information supplied for this case, the analysis concluded that the author of the documents written by Ted and the author of the manifesto were almost certainly the same person. The importance of that conclusion cannot be overstated. For years, the FBI had known the Unabomber through the crimes attributed to him. They had studied what he did, where he struck, what kinds of people he targeted, and how he constructed his devices. But now investigators had a possible identity that could be tested against everything they had learned. The name was Theodore John Kaczynski. The investigation did not simply stop at the linguistic connection. Investigators began comparing what they knew about the Unabomber with what they knew about Kaczynski's life. The similarities accumulated. Kaczynski had been born in Chicago. He had lived in the Salt Lake City area. He had worked in Berkeley. He had a background in mathematics and connections to universities. He had developed strong opposition to industrial society and modern technology. And, crucially, he lived in isolation in Montana. Each fact mattered because the Unabomber's history had already produced a particular profile. The targets repeatedly included universities, scientists, computer-related environments, and people associated with technology or modern institutions. Kaczynski's background contained connections to that world, while his ideology provided a clear contextual connection to the themes expressed by the Unabomber. None of these facts, considered alone, would have solved the case. Being a mathematician did not make someone a bomber. Living in Montana did not establish criminal responsibility. Opposing modern technology was not itself evidence of violence. Even a similarity in writing required careful consideration. The significance came from the combination. The investigators were now able to place the linguistic evidence alongside the known biographical information and the history of the bombing campaign. The case was shifting from an investigation of an unknown person to an investigation focused on a specific individual. That transition was crucial. For almost 2 decades, investigators had been searching for a person who matched the evidence. Now they had a person whose life could be compared with that evidence. The next question was whether the physical evidence would confirm what the words and biography suggested. The answer would come from a remote cabin near Lincoln, Montana. Investigators obtained authorization to search Kaczynski's cabin, and on April 3, 1996, agents arrived there. The search would provide the most direct physical evidence, yet connecting Kaczynski to the bombing campaign. Inside the cabin, investigators found bomb-making components, chemicals, wires, pieces of metal and tubing, batteries, and other materials associated with explosive devices. They also found tens of thousands of pages of handwritten material. The FBI later stated that approximately 40,000 pages of handwritten documents were recovered. Among those materials were notes concerning bomb construction and descriptions connected to the attacks. The significance of the discovery was immediate. The investigation had begun with devices found in public places and packages sent to unsuspecting people. Now investigators were standing inside the private space of the man they believed had constructed them. The cabin provided a physical location where the different strands of the investigation could converge. The writings connected to the intellectual and linguistic evidence. The materials connected to the construction of explosive devices. The records connected to the planning and descriptions of attacks. And the person who had lived there was the same individual whose background had increasingly matched the profile investigators had developed. But there was another discovery that made the situation even more urgent. Investigators found a live bomb wrapped and placed beneath the bed. It was nearly ready to be sent. The presence of that device meant that the danger was not merely historical. The evidence suggested that Kaczynski still possessed the ability to continue the campaign. Because of the danger posed by the device, the FBI had to stop the search after approximately 24 hours. The cabin had transformed the investigation. What had once been an enormous collection of separate clues could now be understood as parts of one. Structure. The manifesto had provided language. David Kaczynski had provided writings for comparison. Linguistic analysis had established an extraordinarily strong connection. Kaczynski's biography fit important aspects of the investigative profile. And the cabin contained physical evidence associated with bomb construction and the attacks. The man who had spent years attempting to remain hidden had left behind something that was far more revealing than a single fingerprint. He had left a record of himself. The words he wanted the public to read had helped investigators find him. The remote place where he had isolated himself contained the physical evidence that strengthened the connection. And beneath the bed was a reminder that the campaign had not necessarily ended simply because investigators had finally found its suspected author. On April 3, 1996, Theodore John Kaczynski was arrested at the cabin near Lincoln, Montana. The nearly 20-year search for the Unabomber had reached its decisive moment. But an arrest was not yet the end of the story. The next stage would be the legal process, where the evidence gathered over years of investigation would confront the question of responsibility in court. In the end, however, the breakthrough had not come from a single spectacular discovery. It had come from accumulation, 16 bombing attacks, the patterns within the targets, years of investigative work, the manifesto, a brother's recognition, linguistic analysis, biographical connections, and finally the contents of a remote Montana cabin. After nearly 2 decades, the anonymous figure behind the name Unabomber finally had a name. After the 1987 bombing in Salt Lake City, the investigation entered a period of uncertainty. The Unabomber had been seen, but not identified. A witness had provided a description of a man wearing a hood and pilot-style glasses, and a sketch had been produced, yet the image did not lead investigators to a confirmed name. Then the attacks stopped. For several years, there were no further bombings attributed to Kaczynski. The silence did not erase the previous attacks, but it created a different kind of uncertainty. The FBI had to continue examining the evidence it already possessed while the person responsible remained outside their reach. The case had already stretched across universities, businesses, technology-related environments, and an airline flight. One person had been killed in 1985, and many others had been injured. Yet there was still no direct path from the crimes to the isolated man who would eventually be identified as Theodore John Kaczynski. Then, in 1993, the attacks began again. The return of the Unabomber demonstrated that the earlier violence had not been an isolated period that had simply ended. The same broader pattern was still present. On June 22, 1993, a geneticist at the University of California was injured when a package exploded in a kitchen. 2 days later, another scientist became the target of a mail bomb. The recipient was a prominent computer scientist at Yale University, and the explosion caused him to lose several fingers. The details of these 2 attacks reinforced what investigators had been seeing for years. Scientific and technological environments remained connected to the campaign. The victims were not selected because of a known personal relationship with the attacker. Instead, the pattern pointed toward the broader targets that had characterized the case from its earliest years: universities, scientists, technology, and institutions associated with modern intellectual and industrial society. By this point, the FBI's Unabomber Task Force had grown into a major investigative operation. Established in 1979, the task force worked with the ATF and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. It eventually involved more than 150 investigators, analysts, and support personnel. They examined bomb fragments, construction materials, correspondence, victims' crime scenes, target histories, and patterns of victim selection. The problem was not a lack of evidence. The problem was that the evidence existed in many different forms, spread across years and locations. The investigators knew that the attacks were connected, but the person responsible had successfully avoided leaving an obvious trail to his identity. Kaczynski had attempted to use materials that were difficult to trace, and he tried to prevent investigators from obtaining straightforward forensic evidence that could lead directly to him. The result was a case in which the investigators knew a great deal about the crimes while knowing very little about the man responsible. They could study the devices. They could study the victims. They could study the letters. They could study the locations. They could identify patterns. But a pattern is not a name. That distinction remained at the heart of the investigation. The 1993 attack showed that the danger had returned, but the following year brought an even more serious development. In 1994, a bombing killed Thomas J. Mosser, an advertising executive in New Jersey. His death became the second confirmed fatality in the Unabomber campaign. The case now involved not only injuries but multiple deaths separated by years and locations. The passage of time had not made the attacks less serious. If anything, the renewed campaign demonstrated that the threat remained capable of producing fatal consequences. For investigators, every new attack also carried another burden, the possibility that the next victim might not survive. By 1995, the campaign was approaching its final known stage. On April 24, 1995, a bomb sent to an office in Sacramento killed Gilbert Brent Murray, the chairman of the California Forestry Association. Murray became the third and final confirmed fatality in the bombing campaign. His death brought the total number of confirmed deaths to 3. Across 16 bombing attacks between 1978 and 1995, 24 people were injured. Those figures define the scale of the campaign, but they do not fully describe what made the case so disturbing. The attacks repeatedly entered ordinary spaces. They appeared through packages in workplaces, at universities, near businesses, and in other environments where people could reasonably expect everyday objects to be harmless. A package could conceal a bomb. A book could conceal a bomb. A location associated with work or study could become a crime scene. The uncertainty was part of the damage. The victims did not need to know Kaczynski personally to become targets. According to the supplied information, many of the targets were selected through research in libraries rather than through personal relationships. That meant that the victims could be connected to the attacker's ideology without ever knowing that. Such a connection existed. They were, in effect, selected because of what they represented within the framework of his beliefs. But whatever ideological explanation Kaczynski attached to his actions, the consequences were concrete. Hugh Scruton was dead. Thomas J. Mosser was dead. Gilbert Brent Murray was dead. 24 other people had been injured. The investigation, therefore, had to confront two different questions at the same time. The first was practical. Who was building and sending these devices? The second was broader. Why had this campaign continued for so long without a confirmed identity? The FBI's answer to the second question involved Kaczynski's deliberate effort to avoid detection. He tried to minimize traceable evidence and remained physically isolated. The investigation had to reconstruct his identity through indirect evidence. Even the investigators' understanding of the suspect had developed slowly. At one point, they did not know the perpetrator's gender with complete certainty, although they largely believed the bomber was male. The 1987 eyewitness had produced a description and a sketch, but the description remained insufficient to establish identity. The investigation, therefore, depended heavily on accumulation. Every new bombing added another piece to the pattern. Every letter provided another piece of language. Every fragment of a device provided another piece of technical evidence. Every victim and target offered another opportunity to understand how the perpetrator selected his victims. By 1995, the FBI had spent years examining those pieces. Then the Unabomber did something that would change the nature of the investigation. Following the bombings of 1994 and 1995, he contacted media organizations and demanded that they publish a long essay explaining his views about modern society. The manuscript was approximately 35,000 words and was titled Industrial Society and Its Future. The demand created a difficult situation. On one hand, Publishing the work meant giving public attention to the person responsible for a deadly campaign. On the other hand, investigators recognized that the document could provide an unprecedented opportunity. For nearly 2 decades, the Unabomber had been communicating through actions, packages, and correspondence. Now he was offering a much larger sample of his own writing. The FBI and the Department of Justice eventually agreed to publication, and in 1995 the essay appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times. The publication was significant because it transformed the investigation from a search based primarily on physical evidence and behavioral patterns into a search that could also examine language on a much larger scale. The Unabomber wanted his ideas to be understood. He wanted his argument about industrial society and modern technology to reach a wide audience. But by putting approximately 35,000 words into the public domain, he also created a new kind of evidence. Investigators could now study not only what the bomber did, but how he expressed himself. Somewhere among those words could be a phrase, a structure, an idea, or a recognizable style that someone who knew the author might identify. The FBI received a huge response after publication, with many people contacting investigators. Most of those leads were not useful, but one response would become decisive. David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother, and his wife noticed similarities between the manifesto and writings they had encountered from Ted. David eventually provided his brother's writings to the FBI. Those documents gave investigators the comparison they had been missing. The investigation had spent years attempting to identify a person through the evidence left by bombs. Now it could compare the Unabomber's public writing with the private writing of a possible suspect. The linguistic analysis became a critical turning point. According to the supplied information, FBI linguistic specialists found similarities in vocabulary, wording, and sentence structure, and concluded that the author of Ted Kaczynski's writings and the author of the manifesto were almost certainly the same person. The campaign had begun in 1978 with a package in a university parking lot. It had passed through years of injuries, one airline incident, the death of Hugh Scruton, the eyewitness sketch, a long silence, renewed attacks, and the deaths of Thomas Mosser and Gilbert Brent Murray. By 1995, 3 people were dead and 24 had been injured. Yet the investigation was finally approaching a point where the name behind the attacks could be tested against the evidence. The words that Kaczynski had wanted the world to read were now helping investigators find him. The next step would take them to Montana, where the life he had constructed in isolation would contain the physical evidence that could connect the anonymous Unabomber to Theodore John Kaczynski. By the time the Unabomber's manifesto appeared in 1995, the FBI had already spent years trying to solve a case that seemed to resist every conventional path toward identification. The investigation had begun with a single package and an injured security employee in 1978. It had grown through university campuses, businesses, and airline flight, and a series of increasingly serious attacks. By 1995, 16 bombing attacks had been attributed to the same perpetrator, leaving 3 people dead and 24 injured. Yet despite the enormous amount of work invested in the case, investigators still did not have a confirmed identity. The difficulty was not that there was no evidence. There was an enormous amount of evidence. The difficulty was that the evidence had to be assembled across nearly 2 decades. The FBI had established a specialized Unabomber task force in 1979, working alongside the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Over time, the task force grew to more than 150 investigators, analysts, and support personnel. Their work involved examining every part of the attacks that might reveal something about the person responsible. Bomb fragments had to be studied. Materials used in the devices had to be examined. Letters had to be analyzed. Victims and targets had to be considered. Crime scenes had to be compared. Investigators also studied the histories of the people who had been targeted and searched for patterns that could explain why one person had been selected while another had not. It was an investigation built around accumulation. A single fragment might provide one small piece of information. A letter might provide another. The circumstances of one attack might become meaningful only after being compared with an attack that had occurred years earlier. The investigators were not simply asking what had happened at each individual crime scene. They were trying to understand whether all of the crime scenes belonged to one continuing campaign and, if so, what that campaign revealed about the person behind it. The pattern gradually became clearer. The targets included universities, professors, students, scientists, computer-related institutions, businesses, and people connected to technology and modern industrial society. According to the supplied information, many victims were selected through research in libraries rather than because Kaczynski had a personal relationship with them. That detail was important because it made the investigation fundamentally different from a case driven by a personal dispute. There was no simple relationship to reconstruct between attacker and victim. Instead, investigators had to examine an ideological and behavioral pattern. The person they were seeking appeared to select people based on what they represented within his opposition to modern technology and industrial society. But even once that pattern became visible, it did not provide a name. Kaczynski also appeared to understand the importance of avoiding traceable evidence. The supplied information indicates that he used materials that were difficult to trace and attempted to prevent investigators from obtaining straightforward forensic evidence. This made the physical investigation particularly challenging. A bomb could be recovered and examined, but the materials did not automatically point to the person who had assembled the device. A letter could reveal something about the writer's thinking, but it did not necessarily reveal where the writer lived. A target could help investigators understand the attacker's interests, but it did not tell them his identity. Each piece of evidence had value, but no single piece was sufficient. Even the most basic characteristics of the suspect were not completely certain at first. Investigators largely believed the perpetrator was male, but the information supplied for this case notes that his gender was not initially established with complete certainty. That fact illustrates the degree of uncertainty surrounding the investigation. After years of work, investigators could describe patterns in the crimes without knowing exactly who was creating them. Then there was the 1987 eyewitness account. A witness had seen a man leaving the area after the bomb was placed outside a computer store in Salt Lake City. The man was described as wearing a hood and pilot-style glasses. A sketch was produced, and the image became widely associated with the Unabomber. But the sketch did not solve the case. It provided an image, not an identity. The person investigators were looking for could still remain somewhere outside the reach of the investigation. After that attack, Kaczynski disappeared from public view for several years. The absence of new attacks created a period in which the investigation had to rely on evidence accumulated from the past. Then the campaign resumed in 1993, and the renewed attacks reinforced the same general pattern. A geneticist at the University of California was injured when a package exploded in a kitchen. 2 days later, a prominent computer scientist at Yale University received a mail bomb and lost several fingers in the explosion. In 1994, Thomas J. Mosser, an advertising executive in New Jersey, was killed in a bombing. On April 24, 1995, Gilbert Brent Murray, chairman of the California Forestry Association, was killed by a bomb sent to an office in Sacramento. These attacks gave investigators more evidence, but they also demonstrated that the danger had not disappeared. The campaign had continued from 1978 into 1995, and its victims continued to pay the price. 3 people had now been killed, and 24 had been injured. The task force, therefore, had 2 responsibilities that were inseparable. It needed to identify the perpetrator, and it needed to prevent another attack. The eventual breakthrough came when the Unabomber himself changed the nature of the evidence available to investigators. After the attacks of 1994 and 1995, he contacted media organizations and demanded publication of a long essay explaining his views about modern society. The essay, approximately 35,000 words long, was titled Industrial Society and Its Future. The FBI and the Department of Justice agreed to its publication in 1995, and it appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times. The decision was controversial because it meant allowing the person responsible for the attacks to place his ideas before a national audience. But from an investigative perspective, the document created an opportunity that the physical evidence had not provided. The FBI now had thousands of words written by the person they believed was responsible for the bombings. Language could be examined in detail. Vocabulary could be compared. Wording and sentence structure could be studied. The investigators were no longer limited to what the bomber had built or where he had struck. They could examine how he wrote. That distinction became crucial. The publication generated a huge response, with many people contacting the FBI. Most of those responses did not provide useful information, but among them was one person who recognized similarities that investigators themselves could not have recognized without access to private family writings. David Kaczynski, Ted Kaczynski's younger brother, and his wife noticed similarities between the manifesto and writings they had seen from Ted. David eventually supplied his brother's writings to the FBI. This was the moment when the investigation acquired a potential name. The FBI's linguistic specialists compared the documents. According to the supplied information, they found similarities in vocabulary, wording, and sentence structure, and concluded that the author of Ted Kaczynski's writings and the author of the manifesto were almost certainly the same person. That conclusion did not mean that investigators could simply declare the case solved. The linguistic evidence had to be examined alongside everything else they already knew. They compared Kaczynski's biography with the profile that had emerged from the investigation. He had been born in Chicago. He had lived in the Salt Lake City area. He had worked in Berkeley. He had a background in mathematics and connections to universities. He opposed industrial society and modern technology, and he lived in isolation in Montana. None of these facts, by itself, proved that he was the Unabomber. But together they formed a pattern that investigators could no longer ignore. The person described by the evidence was increasingly consistent with the life of Theodore John Kaczynski. The investigation had reached a new stage. For years, the FBI had been asking a broad question: who is the Unabomber? Now the question had become much more precise. Does Theodore John Kaczynski fit the evidence accumulated over nearly 20 years? The next answer would come not from another letter or another victim, but from a place Kaczynski had made his own. Investigators obtained authorization to search his cabin near Lincoln, Montana. On April 3, 1996, agents arrived at the remote cabin. They were about to enter the physical center of the investigation, the place where Kaczynski had lived, written, constructed bombs, and planned future attacks. Inside, they would find materials that could connect the man identified through language and biography to the devices that had defined the Unabomber case. The search would transform suspicion into evidence. And within that small cabin, investigators would discover that the threat had not necessarily ended with the attacks of 1995. There was still a bomb waiting to be sent. On April 3, 1996, the investigation that had begun with an unexplained package almost 18 years earlier finally reached a place where the different pieces of the case could be brought together. Federal agents arrived at Theodore John Kaczynski's cabin near Lincoln, Montana. Until this point, investigators had been working through layers of indirect evidence. They had the history of 16 bombing attacks, the injuries and deaths, the pattern of targets, the correspondence, the manifesto, the linguistic comparison, and the biographical connections that had led them toward Kaczynski. But a name was not enough. The investigators needed to know what was inside the place where he had lived in isolation. The cabin represented something different from the evidence gathered at previous crime scenes. It was connected directly to the individual they had identified. If the information obtained there supported the conclusions already reached, the investigation could move from suspicion toward a much stronger evidentiary foundation. The search revealed a remarkable amount of material. Investigators found components associated with bomb construction, chemicals, wires, pieces of metal and tubing, batteries, and other materials connected to explosive devices. They also discovered tens of thousands of pages of handwritten documents. The FBI later stated that approximately 40,000 pages of handwritten material had been recovered. Among these documents were notes concerning bomb construction and descriptions connected to the attacks. The significance of the discovery lay in the way these different categories of evidence reinforced one another. The investigators had already been examining the language of the Unabomber. They had already compared that language with writings produced by Ted Kaczynski. Now, inside Kaczynski's cabin, they found an extensive collection of his handwritten records alongside materials associated with the construction of explosive devices. The cabin, therefore, became more than the isolated home of a suspect. Based on the evidence described in the investigation, it functioned as a place where Kaczynski constructed bombs, maintained records, and planned future actions. The physical surroundings now provided a context for evidence that had previously existed in separate pieces. For years, the FBI had encountered bombs after they had been placed in public locations or delivered to unsuspecting victims. The devices could be examined after an attack, but the person who had built them remained outside the investigators' reach. In Montana, the direction of the investigation was reversed. Instead of beginning with a destroyed device and working backward toward an unknown maker, investigators were now examining the materials of a specific individual in the place where he lived. That distinction was crucial. The cabin also contained another discovery that made the search particularly urgent. Investigators found a live bomb wrapped and placed beneath the bed. The device was nearly ready to be sent. Its presence suggested that the arrest had not come after the danger had completely passed. According to the evidence described in the case, Kaczynski still had the capacity to continue the bombing campaign. The investigation, therefore, was not simply uncovering the history of crimes that had already ended. It was potentially interrupting a threat that could continue. Because of the danger presented by the device, the FBI had to stop the search after approximately 24 hours. The circumstances made the cabin an unusually important piece of evidence. Investigators had found not only materials that could be associated with bomb construction, but also a device that was apparently close to being sent. The discovery added urgency to everything that had already been learned. The manifesto had given investigators a large sample of the Unabomber's language. David Kaczynski had provided writings from Ted. Linguistic analysis had found that the two bodies of writing were almost certainly produced by the same person. Kaczynski's background matched significant aspects of the profile developed from the bombing campaign. And now his cabin contained materials associated with explosive devices and extensive written records. The case had become a chain in which separate forms of evidence supported one another. It is important, however, not to reduce the investigation to the discovery of one dramatic object. The FBI did not arrive at the cabin because they had found a single piece of evidence that independently solved everything. The search was the culmination of years of accumulated investigative work. The bombing pattern had established that the attacks were connected. The task force had spent years examining fragments, materials, correspondence, victims' locations, target histories, and victim selection patterns. The manifesto had opened a new path through language. David Kaczynski's recognition had provided a possible identity. Linguistic analysis had strengthened the connection. The biographical comparison had made Kaczynski increasingly consistent with the investigative profile. The cabin then supplied physical evidence that could be examined in the context of all those earlier findings. This sequence matters because the Unabomber case is often remembered as though one clue suddenly revealed the answer. The supplied evidence shows something more complicated. The breakthrough was cumulative. Each stage made the next stage possible. Without the years of investigative work, the manifesto might have remained simply a manifesto. Without David Kaczynski's recognition, investigators would not have had the same comparison material. Without the linguistic analysis, Kaczynski's name would have remained one possibility among many. Without the biographical connections, the linguistic evidence would have lacked the same broader context. And without the cabin search, investigators would not have obtained the same direct physical evidence connected to bomb construction and the attacks. The cabin also revealed the depth of Kaczynski's written record. Approximately 40,000 pages of handwritten material represented a vast archive of his thinking and activities. Some of those documents concerned bomb construction, while others contained descriptions related to the attacks. The written record, therefore, had two meanings within the investigation. Some of it had already helped identify him through language. Other portions could provide information about the crimes themselves. The man who had attempted to remain hidden had created a substantial written record that ultimately worked against that anonymity. This was one of the central ironies of the case. Kaczynski had spent years trying to prevent investigators from identifying him. He isolated himself. He attempted to avoid traceable materials. He constructed devices designed to make investigation difficult. Yet he also wanted his ideas to reach the public. That desire led to the publication of Industrial Society and its future. The manifesto created the linguistic trail that led investigators toward him. His private writings strengthened that connection. And inside his cabin, investigators found an extensive physical and documentary record. His isolation had made him difficult to find, but it had also concentrated the evidence in one place. The remote cabin, therefore, became the physical counterpart to the manifesto. One represented the words Kaczynski wanted the world to read. The other contained the materials associated with what he had done. Together, they formed a powerful convergence of ideological, linguistic, biographical, and physical evidence. By the time investigators had completed the crucial stages of the search, the central question surrounding the Unabomber had changed. For almost 20 years, investigators had been asking who could possibly be responsible for the attacks. Now they were confronting evidence associated directly with Theodore John Kaczynski. On April 3, 1996, Kaczynski was arrested at the cabin near Lincoln, Montana. The nearly 20-year search had reached its decisive moment. The person who had remained hidden behind the name Unabomber was no longer anonymous. But the arrest did not erase what had already happened. 3 people were dead. 24 others had been injured. 16 bombing attacks had transformed ordinary packages, workplaces, universities, and businesses into potential scenes of violence. The arrest answered the question of identity, but it could not reverse the consequences. The next stage would move away from the remote cabin and into the legal process. Kaczynski would face charges related to the bombing campaign, and the evidence collected over years of investigation would lead toward a final legal resolution. In January 1998, he would plead guilty and accept a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Yet before that conclusion, there remained a question larger than the identity of the Unabomber. What should be remembered when the person behind a notorious case is no longer anonymous? The answer could not be found only in the intelligence attributed to Kaczynski, the ideology he expressed, or the mystery surrounding his years in isolation. The most important facts remained the human ones. Hugh Scruton was killed in 1985. Thomas J. Mosser was killed in 1994. Gilbert Brent Murray was killed in 1995. 24 other people were injured. The cabin, the manifesto, the investigation, and the arrest mattered because they explained how the violence was finally stopped. They did not change what the victims had already suffered. The investigation had finally found its answer, but the cost of reaching that answer had been measured in lives and injuries over nearly 2 decades. After nearly 18 years of investigation, the arrest of Theodore John Kaczynski on April 3, 1996, marked the moment when the long-running Unabomber investigation finally moved into its final phase. For years, investigators had known the crimes through their consequences: injured victims, destroyed objects, bomb fragments, threatening correspondence, and 3 deaths. They had built an enormous investigative record without knowing the identity of the person responsible. Now they had a suspect, a location, and a collection of physical and written evidence that could be examined against everything they had learned since 1978. Kaczynski was arrested at his cabin near Lincoln, Montana. The arrest did not happen because investigators had discovered one simple clue that independently proved everything. It was the result of a chain of evidence that had developed over many years. The bombing pattern had provided the foundation. The letters had provided language. The manifesto had provided an unusually large sample of that language. David Kaczynski had provided writings from his brother. Linguistic analysis had identified striking similarities between those writings and the manifesto. Kaczynski's biography corresponded with important elements of the profile developed by investigators. Finally, the search of his cabin revealed physical evidence associated with the construction of explosive devices and extensive handwritten records. The cabin, therefore, became one of the most important locations in the entire case. Inside were chemicals, wires, pieces of metal and tubing, batteries, and other materials associated with bomb construction. Investigators also recovered tens of thousands of pages of handwritten material, with the FBI later describing the collection as approximately 40,000 pages. Among those documents were notes concerning bomb construction and descriptions connected to the attacks. These discoveries mattered because they connected the suspect to the kind of activity investigators had been studying for nearly 2 decades. Until this point, the FBI had repeatedly encountered the results of bomb construction. Now investigators were examining materials in the home of the man they had identified as the likely perpetrator. The distinction was profound. The case was no longer based only on reconstructing the actions of an unknown person from fragments left behind at different crime scenes. Investigators were now examining a concentrated body of evidence belonging to a specific individual. The discovery of a live bomb beneath the bed added another important dimension to the arrest. The device was wrapped and apparently nearly ready to be sent. This meant that Kaczynski's arrest did not simply occur after a campaign that had definitely ended. The evidence indicated that he still possessed the ability to continue. The threat represented by the Unabomber, therefore, remained relevant at the moment investigators entered the cabin. The search itself had to be handled with caution because of the danger posed by the device, and the FBI stopped the search after approximately 24 hours. The discovery reinforced the urgency of the arrest. For almost 20 years, investigators had been attempting to prevent the next attack without knowing exactly where it would come from. Now the person they believed responsible had been located, and a device apparently prepared for future use had been found in his cabin. The arrest effectively ended the period during which the Unabomber could continue operating as an unidentified figure outside the reach of investigators. But identifying and arresting a suspect was only one part of the legal process. The evidence gathered during the investigation would now have to support the government's case. Kaczynski faced charges connected with the bombing campaign. The legal proceedings also raised questions about how the case should proceed and whether it would culminate in a lengthy trial. The supplied information does not provide a detailed transcript of courtroom exchanges, individual testimony, or a complete chronology of every procedural hearing. For that reason, those details cannot responsibly be reconstructed here. What is confirmed in the provided material is the eventual legal outcome. Kaczynski pleaded guilty in January 1998 and accepted a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. That resolution brought the formal legal process to an end without the need for a prolonged trial, establishing his responsibility through a full presentation of all the evidence before a jury. By accepting the plea and the resulting sentence, Kaczynski avoided the possibility of a longer legal battle over the bombing charges while receiving a punishment that ensured he would remain in prison for life. The conclusion was stark when measured against the length of the investigation. The FBI had spent almost 20 years trying to identify the person responsible for 16 bombing attacks. The campaign had begun in 1978 with an injured security employee at the University of Illinois Chicago's Circle campus. It had expanded to Northwestern University, an American Airlines flight, United Airlines Chairman Percy Woods, the University of Utah, Vanderbilt University, the University of California, Berkeley, a Sacramento computer store, and other locations. It had produced injuries across multiple states and ultimately claimed 3 confirmed lives. Hugh Scruton was killed in 1985. Thomas J. Mosser was killed in 1994. Gilbert Brent Murray was killed in 1995. 24 other people were injured. By the time Kaczynski entered the final stage of the legal process, the numbers had become part of the historical record, but they represented individual human beings whose lives had been permanently altered. A legal conclusion could assign responsibility and impose punishment, but it could not restore what had been lost. The resolution of the case also demonstrated why the investigation had been so difficult. Kaczynski had deliberately maintained distance from society. He lived in isolation in Montana and attempted to avoid leaving easily traceable evidence. He constructed devices from materials that investigators found difficult to trace. He selected targets through a process that, according to the supplied information, often involved research in libraries rather than personal relationships. His attacks were separated by long periods, including a substantial interruption after the 1987 bombing. These factors made the case resistant to conventional investigative methods. There was no single relationship connecting him to his victims, no continuous physical trail leading from one crime scene to the next, and no obvious public identity behind the name Unabomber. Yet the very things that made the case difficult eventually became part of the evidence against him. His ideology was expressed through writing. His writing created a linguistic pattern. His desire to have that ideology published brought the manifesto into public view. The manifesto was recognized by someone who knew his writing. That recognition led to the FBI's comparison of his documents. The comparison identified an extraordinary similarity. His biography then fit important aspects of the investigative profile, and the search of his cabin produced physical materials and records associated with bomb construction and the attacks. The sequence is important because it shows that the final identification did not depend on a single dramatic revelation. It was the accumulation of evidence that transformed an unknown bomber into an identified defendant. The manifesto was particularly important because it exposed a contradiction at the center of Kaczynski's attempt to remain anonymous. He wanted his identity hidden, but he also wanted his ideas heard. He had spent years communicating through bombs and letters, but the 35,000-word essay gave investigators something far more revealing than a short message. It provided a large body of language that could be compared with known writings. In seeking to explain himself to the world, he inadvertently gave investigators a way to recognize him. David Kaczynski's role in that process was equally significant. His recognition did not arise from a random connection. He and his wife noticed similarities between the manifesto and writings associated with Ted. David then provided those writings to the FBI. That decision became one of the central turning points in the investigation. It allowed specialists to conduct the linguistic comparison that moved Kaczynski from a possible identity toward the central suspect. The subsequent search of the Montana cabin supplied the physical evidence that strengthened the case. Further, by January 1998, Kaczynski accepted the legal conclusion through his guilty plea. He received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The man once known to investigators only as the Unabomber would spend the rest of his life in federal custody. The nearly 20-year investigation was over. But the end of the investigation did not mean the end of the questions surrounding the case. The Unabomber had attempted to make his ideology the explanation for his violence. The legal system instead reduced the central issue to responsibility for acts that had injured and killed people. Whatever arguments Kaczynski wanted society to consider about industrial society and technology, the consequences of his chosen methods remained clear. Bombs had not merely delivered an argument. They had delivered suffering. They had left 3 people dead and 24 injured. The final legal result, therefore, carried 2 meanings. It marked the end of one of the FBI's longest and most difficult investigations, and it established a permanent consequence for the man responsible. Yet the most important part of the story was not the notoriety of the Unabomber, nor the mystery surrounding his identity. It was the fact that the campaign eventually stopped, and that the victims and their families no longer had to live with the uncertainty of wondering whether the person responsible would strike again. In 1998, after years of investigation and nearly 2 decades of violence, the legal case against Theodore John Kaczynski reached its conclusion. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole. There would be no return to the cabin, no new campaign, and no possibility of beginning again. The anonymous bomber had finally been identified, arrested, and permanently removed from society. What remained was the record of the people who had been injured and killed, and the lessons of an investigation in which language, patience, accumulated evidence, and the decision of one family member to come forward ultimately brought an almost 20-year search to an end. Theodore John Kaczynski was arrested at his cabin near Lincoln, Montana, on April 3, 1996. The Unabomber investigation entered a stage that investigators had been working toward for almost 2 decades. The name that had remained unknown for years was finally attached to a person. The man behind 16 bombing attacks was no longer an unidentified figure moving between locations and leaving explosive devices behind. He was Theodore John Kaczynski, but an arrest could not erase the history that had led to it. Between 1978 and 1995, the campaign had killed 3 people and injured 24 others. Those numbers are frequently repeated because they provide a concise measure of the scale of the case. Yet behind each number was an individual who had encountered violence without choosing to participate in any conflict with Kaczynski. The first confirmed death was Hugh Scruton, the owner of a computer store in Sacramento. On December 11, 1985, a bomb placed in the parking lot of his business exploded, killing him. Scruton's death marked a significant change in the campaign. Before that point, the attacks had caused injuries and created serious danger. But the December 1985 bombing demonstrated that the devices could kill. The campaign had crossed from a series of attacks causing physical injuries into something more deadly. The second confirmed fatality came almost a decade later. In 1994, Thomas J. Mosser, an advertising executive in New Jersey, was killed in a bombing. His death demonstrated that the passage of time had not ended the threat. The Unabomber had returned after periods of inactivity, and the consequences could once again be fatal. Then, on April 24, 1995, Gilbert Brent Murray, chairman of the California Forestry Association, was killed by a bomb sent to an office in Sacramento. Murray became the third and final confirmed fatality attributed to the campaign. By then, the investigation had become one of the most prolonged and complex criminal investigations undertaken by the FBI. 16 bombing attacks had occurred between 1978 and 1995. 24 people had been injured. The victims and targets had been connected to universities, science, computers, businesses, and other aspects of modern industrial society. Some had been professors or students. Others worked in scientific, technological, or business environments. The selection of victims was particularly important to understanding the nature of the campaign. According to the supplied information, many targets were selected through research in libraries rather than because Kaczynski had personal relationships with them. That meant the victims could become targets because of what they represented within his ideology, rather than because of something they had personally done to him. This distinction matters when considering the human consequences of the case. An ideological belief may explain what an offender claims to oppose, but it does not transform the people affected by that violence into symbols rather than human beings. A professor was still a professor, a student was still a student, an employee was still an employee, and the three people who died were still individuals whose lives ended because of deliberate acts of violence. Kaczynski's opposition to industrial society and modern technology formed the ideological background of his campaign. But the consequences were physical and immediate. His beliefs did not remain confined to writing. They were translated into bombs. That transformation is one of the central facts of the case. The Unabomber wanted his ideas to be understood. His desire for his manifesto to be published ultimately became the pathway through which investigators could identify him. In that sense, the final stages of the investigation contained an important contradiction. Kaczynski had spent years trying to avoid being identified. He lived in isolation, attempted to avoid traceable forensic evidence, and used materials that investigators found difficult to connect to their source. Yet he also wanted to communicate. He wanted the public to read his explanation of industrial society and technology. The resulting manuscript, Industrial Society and Its Future, was approximately 35,000 words long. When it was published in the Washington Post and the New York Times in 1995, it gave investigators something they had never possessed on such a scale: an extensive example of the perpetrator's own language. The manifesto became more than a political or ideological document within the investigation. It became evidence. David Kaczynski and his wife recognized similarities between the published text and writings associated with Ted Kaczynski. David then provided those writings to the FBI. Linguistic specialists compared the materials and, according to the supplied information, concluded that the author of Ted Kaczynski's writings and the author of the manifesto were almost certainly the same person. That conclusion became the bridge between an anonymous offender and a named suspect. The investigation then compared Kaczynski's biography with the profile that had emerged from the crime. He had been born in Chicago. He had lived in the Salt Lake City area. He had worked in Berkeley. He had a background in mathematics and connections to universities. He opposed industrial society and modern technology, and he lived in isolation in Montana. These facts did not become meaningful because any single one proved criminal responsibility. They became meaningful because they formed a pattern alongside the linguistic evidence and the history of the attacks. The search of Kaczynski's cabin supplied another layer of evidence. Investigators found chemicals, wires, pieces of metal and tubing, batteries, and other materials associated with bomb construction. They recovered approximately 40,000 pages of handwritten documents, including notes concerning bomb construction and descriptions connected to the attacks. They also found a live bomb beneath the bed, wrapped and apparently nearly ready to be sent. The discovery was a reminder that the danger had not necessarily ended before the arrest. Kaczynski still possessed the means to continue. The FBI had not merely found a historical collection of materials connected to crimes that were safely in the past. They had encountered evidence suggesting that another attack could potentially have occurred. The search had to be stopped after approximately 24 hours because of the danger posed by the device. The arrest therefore represented both the identification of the perpetrator and the interruption of a continuing threat. In January 1998, Kaczynski pleaded guilty and accepted a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. That decision brought the legal process to its conclusion as described in the supplied information. The case no longer required the same uncertainty that had characterized the previous 18 years. Investigators knew who the Unabomber was. The government had obtained a guilty plea. Kaczynski would spend the rest of his life imprisoned. But the legal conclusion could not provide a simple ending to the human story. For the victims, the consequences did not disappear when the investigation ended. The 3 deaths remained permanent. The injuries suffered by 24 people remained part of their lives. The fear created by the attacks could not be measured solely through case numbers or court documents. The campaign had demonstrated how vulnerable ordinary environments could become when an unknown person deliberately transformed familiar objects into weapons. A university campus, a workplace, a package, a parking lot, or even an aircraft could suddenly become associated with danger. That uncertainty was one of the defining characteristics of the case. The Unabomber was difficult to identify partly because he remained physically distant from his victims and because the targets were often connected through his ideology rather than personal relationships. Yet the same distance that helped conceal him also contributed to the impersonality of the attacks. The victims did not have the opportunity to confront a known adversary or understand why they personally had become targets. They encountered the consequences of decisions made by someone who had deliberately remained hidden. The eventual investigation demonstrated that anonymity is not the same as invisibility. Kaczynski could isolate himself, avoid public attention, and attempt to limit forensic traces. But he could not completely remove the evidence created by his own actions. Every attack added another piece to the pattern. Every letter added another piece of language. Every target added another piece of information about his selection process. The manifesto added thousands of words. David Kaczynski added private writings that could be compared with those words. The cabin added physical evidence. The investigation succeeded not because one clue suddenly revealed everything, but because investigators continued assembling the pieces until they formed a coherent picture. That may be the most important lesson in the Unabomber investigation. Criminal investigations do not always end with a dramatic discovery. Sometimes they end through accumulation, patience, comparison, and the willingness to reconsider evidence that may initially appear insignificant. The Unabomber Task Force spent years examining material that did not immediately provide an identity. The breakthrough came when different categories of evidence began to reinforce one another. The language matched. The biography matched important elements of the profile. The cabin contained relevant physical evidence. The written records connected Kaczynski to the intellectual and practical aspects of the campaign. And the live bomb demonstrated why identifying him mattered immediately. Ultimately, the story of the Unabomber should not be remembered primarily as the story of a mysterious genius, a remote cabin, or an unusual ideology. Those elements may explain why the case captured public attention, but they are not its most important human truth. The central fact is simpler and darker. A man chose to use violence against other people to force attention toward his beliefs. 16 bombing attacks followed. 3 people died. 24 were injured. In 1996, the campaign finally ended with Kaczynski's arrest. In 1998, it ended legally with his guilty plea and sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The mystery of the Unabomber was solved, but the damage could not be solved with it. The investigation could identify the perpetrator. The courts could impose punishment, but neither could restore the lives taken or undo the injuries suffered. That is why the final measure of the case is not simply that the FBI found Theodore John Kaczynski. It is that after nearly 2 decades, the violence stopped. The victims were no longer facing an unidentified attacker, and the long search for the person responsible finally came to an end. The arrest of Theodore John Kaczynski in April 1996 brought an end to the uncertainty surrounding one of the longest-running bombing investigations in the history of the FBI. For almost 20 years, investigators had followed a trail that crossed universities, businesses, scientific institutions, an airline in multiple states. 16 bombing attacks had been attributed to the same perpetrator. 3 people had been killed, and 24 had been injured. Yet even after Kaczynski was identified and arrested, the case did not become simple. There remained the question of how such a long campaign had been possible, why the investigation had taken so many years, and what the case revealed about the relationship between ideology, violence, anonymity, and investigation. The final legal outcome was established in January 1998, when Kaczynski pleaded guilty and accepted a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. With that decision, the legal uncertainty ended. The man known for years only as the Unabomber had a confirmed identity and a permanent sentence. But the end of a criminal case does not necessarily mean the end of its consequences. For the victims, the consequences had begun much earlier. On May 25, 1978, the first known bombing injured a university security employee at the University of Illinois, Chicago's Circle campus. In the years that followed, other people were injured by bombs at universities, in businesses, and in other locations. The attacks reached into places that had previously represented ordinary life: classrooms, workplaces, parking lots, and packages delivered through the mail. One of the most disturbing characteristics of the campaign was precisely this uncertainty. The victims were not necessarily people who knew Kaczynski. According to the supplied information, many targets were selected through research in libraries rather than because Kaczynski had personal relationships with them. The people who became victims could therefore have no idea that they had entered his attention. They did not need to have met him, argued with him, or done something directly against him. Their connection to the campaign could simply be that they represented a profession, institution, or aspect of modern society that he opposed. This distinction is essential when looking back at the case. Kaczynski's writings expressed opposition to industrial society and modern technology. He wanted those ideas to be heard, and his manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, was approximately 35,000 words long. But the ideology expressed in those pages existed alongside a campaign of physical violence. The people who encountered his bombs were not theoretical concepts. They were individuals. Hugh Scruton was a store owner. Thomas J. Mosser was an advertising executive. Gilbert Brent Murray was chairman of the California Forestry Association. Their deaths were real and irreversible. 24 other people survived attacks that injured them. The final number of 3 deaths can appear small when compared with other notorious criminal cases. But the significance of the Unabomber investigation was never determined only by the number of casualties. It was also defined by its duration, its geographic reach, and the uncertainty surrounding the identity of the attacker. The campaign lasted from 1978 through 1995, nearly 2 decades. During that time, the FBI and its partner agencies had to investigate attacks separated by years and locations. The Unabomber Task Force, established in 1979, eventually involved more than 150 investigators, analysts, and support personnel. They worked with the FBI, the ATF, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Their work illustrates how difficult it can be to identify an offender who deliberately avoids conventional forms of detection. Kaczynski attempted to use materials that were difficult to trace and to avoid leaving forensic evidence that could easily lead investigators to him. He lived in isolation in Montana, away from the environments in which his targets worked. He did not present himself publicly as the person responsible for the attacks. Instead, the investigators had to construct an understanding of him from what he left behind. That process took years. The investigation examined bomb fragments, construction materials, correspondence, victims, locations, target histories, and patterns in the selection of victims. Each attack added information, but none immediately provided the answer. Even the 1987 eyewitness observation, which produced a description of a man wearing a hood and pilot-style glasses, did not identify Kaczynski. A sketch could give investigators a visual representation of the suspect, but it could not establish his name. The investigation therefore demonstrates an important principle. Information and identification are not the same thing. Investigators can know a great deal about a criminal's behavior without knowing who the criminal is. They can understand patterns without being able to connect those patterns to a particular person. In the Unabomber case, that gap lasted for years. The decisive change came when Kaczynski chose to communicate on a much larger scale. After the attacks of 1994 and 1995, he demanded that his manifesto be published. The FBI and the Department of Justice agreed, and the essay appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times in 1995. The publication was controversial because it gave public attention to a person who had used violence. Yet it also created an opportunity that investigators had not previously possessed. They now had a large sample of the perpetrator's writing. That language became the key to the final stage of the investigation. David Kaczynski and his wife recognized similarities between the manifesto and writings associated with Ted. David then provided those writings to the FBI. Linguistic specialists compared the documents and, according to the supplied information, concluded that the authors were almost certainly the same person. This moment illustrates another important feature of the case. The breakthrough came through recognition rather than a traditional forensic discovery. There was no single camera image that clearly revealed the perpetrator. There was no simple fingerprint that ended the investigation. Instead, the language Kaczynski had chosen to make public became the bridge between the anonymous bomber and his real identity. The irony is difficult to overlook. Kaczynski had spent years attempting to remain anonymous, yet his desire to communicate his ideas helped expose him. He wanted society to read his argument. He wanted his opposition to industrial society and modern technology to be understood. But the very act of explaining himself created a linguistic record that someone familiar with his earlier writings could recognize. His words became part of the evidence that led investigators to his cabin in Montana. The search of that cabin then provided another critical layer of evidence. Investigators found bomb-making components, chemicals, wires, metal and tubing, batteries, and other materials associated with explosive devices. They also recovered approximately 40,000 pages of handwritten documents. Among them were notes concerning bomb construction and descriptions connected to the attacks. Most significantly, investigators found a live bomb beneath the bed, apparently nearly ready to be sent. That discovery gave the arrest an additional meaning. It was not simply the capture of a suspect after a completed historical investigation. It interrupted a situation in which, according to the evidence described, Kaczynski still had the ability to continue. The campaign could have remained a threat if he had not been identified and arrested. The cabin therefore became the physical endpoint of a search that had begun with packages and explosions scattered across the United States. The investigation's success came from combining different forms of evidence rather than relying on one spectacular clue. The bombing pattern identified the nature of the campaign. The correspondence provided language. The manifesto provided thousands of words. David Kaczynski provided comparison material. Linguistic analysis connected the writings. Kaczynski's biography fit important aspects of the profile. The cabin provided physical evidence. The live bomb demonstrated the continuing danger. Together, these elements transformed a decades-old mystery into a completed criminal case. Yet there is another lesson in the case, and it concerns the danger of allowing the identity of an offender to overshadow the people harmed by his actions. The name Unabomber became famous. The manifesto became famous. The Montana cabin became famous. The investigation itself became a subject of enormous public interest. But the victim should remain at the center of the story. The case began with an injured person and eventually produced 3 deaths and 24 injuries. The investigation was necessary because people had been harmed, not because the offender was mysterious. The legal process was necessary because responsibility had to be established and punishment imposed. The final sentence of life imprisonment without parole ensured that Kaczynski would remain imprisoned, but it could not undo the consequences for those who had been attacked. This is perhaps the clearest reflection to take from the Unabomber case. Ideas can be debated. Technology can be criticized. Industrial society can be questioned. People can disagree profoundly about the direction of modern civilization. But none of those debates require the deliberate destruction of another person's life. Kaczynski chose violence as a means of forcing attention toward his beliefs. And the result was not an intellectual resolution, but a trail of injuries, deaths, fear, and a nearly 20-year investigation. The final chapter, therefore, cannot simply be about how the FBI found him. It must also be about what remained after he was found. The mystery disappeared, but the consequences did not. The bombs stopped, but the injuries remained. The investigation ended, but the memories of the victims did not. And the manifesto that Kaczynski wanted the world to read became, ironically, one of the instruments that helped expose him. In the end, the Unabomber case was solved not because the perpetrator was invisible and then suddenly became visible, but because years of evidence gradually overcame his efforts to remain hidden. The campaign began in 1978 and ended in 1995. The arrest came in 1996. The guilty plea came in 1998. Those dates mark the chronology of the case, but they also represent something more. Nearly 2 decades in which investigators continued searching while victims and their families carried the consequences of violence. The final lesson is therefore not about the power of a mysterious criminal to evade detection. It is about the persistence of an investigation, the importance of evidence, and the fact that even a person who attempts to disappear can leave behind a record of his actions. In Kaczynski's case, that record was eventually enough to reveal the man behind the name. And once the name was known, the long hunt was finally over. The story of Theodore John Kaczynski ends with a fact that is both simple and difficult to fully comprehend. After nearly 2 decades of bombing attacks, the person behind the name Unabomber was identified, arrested, and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. The campaign had begun on May 25, 1978, with a package discovered at the University of Illinois Chicago's Circle campus. It ended as a criminal investigation in the late 1990s, after 16 bombing attacks had left 3 people dead and 24 injured. But between those 2 points was a complicated history of violence, investigation, ideology, uncertainty, and eventually identification. Looking back at the case, the most important question is not simply how Kaczynski managed to avoid detection for so long. It is also what finally made that anonymity impossible. For years, the Unabomber appeared to exist almost entirely through the evidence he left behind. Investigators knew the devices, but not the man who built them. They knew the targets, but not the person who selected them. They knew the letters, but not the identity of the writer. They had an eyewitness description and a sketch, but still no confirmed name. The FBI's Unabomber Task Force, working with the ATF and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, eventually grew to more than 150 investigators, analysts, and support personnel. They examined bomb fragments, construction materials, correspondence, victims' locations, target histories, and patterns of victim selection. Yet the investigation continued for years without a decisive identification. That difficulty was partly created by Kaczynski's own methods. He attempted to avoid leaving traceable forensic evidence and used materials that were difficult to connect to their source. He lived in isolation in Montana, physically distant from many of the environments where his victims lived and worked. He did not depend upon personal relationships with his targets. According to the supplied information, many of them were selected through research in libraries. This meant that investigators could not simply look for a former friend, colleague, business partner, or known enemy who might have had a reason to attack them. Instead, they had to understand an offender who selected people according to an ideological framework. That framework centered on his opposition to industrial society and modern technology. Yet the existence of an ideology did not make the investigation easier. Many people may hold strong opinions about technology, science, universities, or industrial society without ever committing violence. The challenge was therefore to distinguish an abstract belief from the specific individual who had translated that belief into a campaign of bombing. Over time, the investigators accumulated enough information to understand the pattern, but the identity remained hidden. The 1987 attack in Salt Lake City demonstrated how close they could come without solving the case. A witness saw a man leaving the area after placing a bomb outside a computer store. The man was described as wearing a hood and pilot-style glasses. A sketch was created. For investigators, This was a valuable development because it gave the unknown offender a visible form. But a face, or even a description, is not necessarily an identity. The investigation still lacked the connection between the image and a real person. The years that followed demonstrated the same difficulty. Kaczynski could disappear from public attention and later return with another attack. In 1993, the campaign resumed with injuries to a geneticist at the University of California and a prominent computer scientist at Yale University. In 1994, Thomas J. Mosser was killed. In 1995, Gilbert Brent Murray was killed. The final confirmed death brought the total number of victims killed to 3. 24 other people had been injured. Each new attack extended the investigation and reinforced the need to identify the person responsible. Yet the breakthrough ultimately came from something that Kaczynski himself wanted to provide: his words. After the attacks of 1994 and 1995, he demanded that his approximately 35,000-word manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, be published. The FBI and Department of Justice agreed, and the document appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Kaczynski wanted his ideas to reach the public, but the publication created an unintended consequence. It gave investigators an enormous sample of the perpetrator's language. That language became a potential fingerprint. David Kaczynski and his wife recognized similarities between the manifesto and writings associated with Ted Kaczynski. David provided those writings to the FBI. Linguistic specialists compared the documents and concluded, according to the supplied information, that the authors were almost certainly the same person. The significance of that moment goes beyond the specific details of linguistic analysis. It demonstrates how a person can reveal himself through the very thing he believes will conceal him. Kaczynski had tried to remain anonymous physically, but he could not completely separate himself from the way he expressed his thoughts. His words carried patterns that were recognizable to someone who knew him. The manifesto, therefore, became a bridge between the anonymous Unabomber and Theodore John Kaczynski. Investigators then compared his life with what they had learned about the offender. Kaczynski had been born in Chicago. He had lived in the Salt Lake City area. He had worked in Berkeley. He had a background in mathematics and connections to universities. He opposed industrial society and modern technology. He lived in isolation in Montana. These facts were significant not because any one of them proved that he was the bomber, but because they fit together with the linguistic evidence and the existing investigative profile. The investigation had finally reached a point where a specific person could be compared against the accumulated evidence of nearly 2 decades. The search of his Montana cabin then provided the physical evidence that strengthened the case. Investigators found materials associated with bomb construction, including chemicals, wires, metal and tubing, batteries, and other components. They also found approximately 40,000 pages of handwritten documents, including notes concerning bomb construction and descriptions connected to the attacks. Most strikingly, they discovered a live bomb beneath the bed, apparently nearly ready to be sent. That discovery showed why the arrest was important beyond solving an old mystery. The evidence indicated that Kaczynski still had the ability to continue. The campaign might have produced another victim if he had not been identified and arrested. The cabin therefore became the final physical point in a trail that had crossed the United States. For almost 20 years, the legal conclusion followed. In January 1998, Kaczynski pleaded guilty and accepted a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The legal process had reached its final outcome. The Unabomber would no longer be able to conduct the campaign that had begun in 1978. But the sentence could not return the lives of those who had died. Hugh Scruton was killed in 1985. Thomas J. Mosser was killed in 1994. Gilbert Brent Murray was killed in 1995. 24 others were injured. These facts should remain central when remembering the case. It is easy for a notorious criminal investigation to become focused on the offender, his intelligence, his isolation, his writings, his methods, or the mystery surrounding his identity. But those elements can unintentionally move attention away from the people who suffered. The victims did not choose to become part of an ideological conflict. They were individuals who encountered deliberate violence. Their injuries and deaths were the real consequences of the campaign. The Unabomber case also demonstrates the difference between explaining an action and justifying it. Kaczynski's ideology may explain why he believed modern industrial society and technology were problems. His writings may explain how he understood those problems. But an explanation of his beliefs does not justify the use of bombs against other human beings. The case provides no basis for romanticizing the violence as an intellectual statement. The ideas existed independently of the harm caused by the methods Kaczynski chose. The most important distinction is therefore between criticism and violence. A person can reject technology. A person can oppose industrial society. A person can write an argument of tens of thousands of words. None of those acts require the killing or injury of another person. Kaczynski crossed that boundary repeatedly. The investigation's final success also offers a lesson about patience. There was no single moment when the FBI suddenly understood everything. Instead, the case was solved through accumulation. The first bombing established the beginning of a pattern. Later attacks expanded it. The 1987 witness provided a description. The manifesto provided language. David Kaczynski provided private writings for comparison. Linguistic analysis connected the documents. Kaczynski's biography matched important parts of the profile. The cabin supplied physical evidence. The live bomb demonstrated the continuing danger. Each element strengthened the others. That is why the Unabomber case remains such a significant example of a long criminal investigation. It shows that even when an offender is careful, isolated, and apparently difficult to trace, actions leave records. Sometimes those records are physical. Sometimes they are written. Sometimes they exist in patterns that become visible only after years of comparison. Kaczynski tried to disappear into isolation, but he could not completely erase the evidence of what he had done. In the end, the thing that helped reveal him was not necessarily something he had tried to hide. It was something he had deliberately created for the world to read. His manifesto was intended to explain his worldview. Instead, it helped investigators identify its author. By 1998, the long investigation had reached its conclusion. The Unabomber was no longer an unidentified figure. Theodore John Kaczynski had been arrested, had pleaded guilty, and had received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The campaign that began in 1978 was over. Yet the final chapter belongs not to the mystery of the man, but to the people affected by his choices. 3 people were dead. 24 had been injured. Families had been left with consequences that no arrest or sentence could undo. The investigation could provide an answer to the question of who was responsible. The legal system could provide punishment, but neither could restore what had been taken. That is where the story of the Unabomber ultimately ends, not with the image of a mysterious criminal, and not with the fascination surrounding his cabin or his manifesto, but with the recognition that violence leaves consequences long after the investigation is finished. The name Theodore John Kaczynski may remain attached to one of the longest FBI investigations of its kind, but the most important legacy of the case is simpler. The bomb stopped, the uncertainty ended, the perpetrator was identified, and the record of the victims remained as the clearest reminder of what the campaign actually was. Not an abstract battle over technology or modern society, but a prolonged series of deliberate acts that caused real human suffering.